welcome back. Tonight, we explore the conspiracy theories, hidden mysteries, and whispered lore of the Resident Evil universe. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. The architect knew too much. George Trevor was the brilliant and celebrated architect commissioned by Oswell E. Spencer to design the Spencer Mansion deep in the Arklay Mountains in the early 1960s. Trevor crafted every puzzle mechanism, every hidden passage, every lock and lever with painstaking precision, pouring years of creative genius into what he believed was a commission to be proud of. But Spencer had never intended to let him walk away. What the in-game files confirm is grim. Jessica and Lisa Trevor arrived at the estate on November 10th, 1967, and were taken that very night by Spencer's men and subjected to progenitor virus experiments in the underground laboratory. George arrived 3 days later, on November 13th, was told his family had left to visit a sick relative, and only gradually realized the truth as the days passed. He was eventually imprisoned, attempted to escape through the very underground passages he had designed, lost his lighter in the dark. That detail is preserved in his diary files in the remake, and appears to have perished somewhere in the mansion's tunnel network, unable to find his way out. What the fandom has long theorized from this is that the puzzle architecture of the Spencer Mansion was never incidental. George Trevor was celebrated for his fondness for gimmicks and secret rooms, and Spencer had selected him specifically for that reputation. It stands to reason that a man who designed the traps and hidden passages of that estate would have quietly built in at least one route only he knew about, a final exit he never managed to reach. Whether those passages still held their secrets by 1998, when STARS teams walked those same corridors, is a question the crumbling estate cannot answer. Wesker was never truly Umbrella's. Albert Wesker spent years embedded deep within Umbrella's infrastructure. First, as a researcher under James Marcus at the Executive Training School, then as a senior researcher at the Arklay Laboratory, then as a planted mole within the Raccoon City Police Department's STARS unit. He wore the role of loyal operative with absolute precision. What the series confirms is that Wesker had already been in contact with a rival corporation before the Mansion incident, quietly negotiating the sale of Umbrella's Tyrant combat data. This is established in Wesker's report and Umbrella Chronicles. He allowed himself to be impaled by the T-002 Tyrant, not as an accident, but as a calculated exit, knowing William Birkin had already provided him the prototype progenitor virus that would resurrect him with superhuman capability. What the fandom has built on top of these confirmed facts is a compelling inference that the cold precision of Wesker's timing suggests he had finalized his exit plan long before the Mansion incident, possibly years before. He showed no panic, no improvisation. Based on how methodically he operated throughout the preceding years, it seems reasonable to conclude he had mentally severed himself from Umbrella long before that night in the laboratory, and was simply waiting for the conditions that would make his departure permanent and irrevocable. The T-virus was never meant to make zombies. One of the more unsettling readings of the series concerns the original intention of the T-virus project when it was still under the stewardship of Umbrella's co-founder James Marcus. What the games confirm is that Marcus spent years working with leeches as the primary organism for his research, successfully creating the T-virus by combining leech DNA with progenitor. a breakthrough he achieved in 1977. Spencer's stated goal, documented in multiple files, was to create a superior form of humanity, an Übermensch guided by viral enhancement. The mindless shambling zombie, from this angle, looks less like an intended product and more like a catastrophic byproduct of a process that was never meant to end there. If we take Spencer's philosophical intent at face value, it seems plausible that Marcus's original vision for the T-virus was something closer to controlled selective enhancement, a host that retained intelligence while gaining physical capability. The Tyrant Project was the closest functional expression of that goal. What this implies is that every zombie outbreak in the series, every city consumed by the Walking Dead, could be read as the cascading result of a research program that failed at its stated objective and succeeded in producing something far worse than anything its founders imagined. Spencer approved the military applications because the money was there. The apocalyptic horror was the invoice that came later. Spencer orchestrated his own exposure. After the Raccoon City disaster, Umbrella's founding CEO, Oswell E. Spencer, disappeared into a secluded coastal estate in Europe and spent years evading the international manhunt pursuing him. He watched through intermediaries as the Raccoon trials dragged on, as Umbrella dissolved, as the company he had spent decades building collapsed into financial ruin and public infamy. What the series confirms is that Spencer did eventually have his butler Patrick make contact with Wesker through a black market dealer. He wanted Wesker to find him. Spencer revealed to Wesker in their final confrontation exactly what Project W had been, a eugenics program that had abducted gifted children, given them the Wesker surname, and infected them with the progenitor prototype. Wesker was the only surviving male subject, though Alex Wesker had also survived, a detail Spencer apparently omitted in that conversation. The fandom interpretation that draws the most attention here is the question of why. Spencer was dying, confined to a wheelchair, and had arranged his own discovery. One reading, consistent with everything we know about him, is that Spencer wanted to see if the product of his life's work would respond with the gratitude of an heir or the fury of a creation. He may have believed Wesker would choose to continue what he had started. Based on what Wesker then did, driving his hand through Spencer's chest and stepping over the body, it seems Spencer had badly miscalculated which answer he was going to receive. The progenitor flower was already dying. The rare flower at the heart of Resident Evil's entire viral origin story, the Stairway of the Sun, found growing in an ancient hidden garden in the Kijuju region of West Africa, was never abundant. Spencer, Edward Ashford, and James Marcus all traveled there after piecing together its location from historical records, and the progenitor virus was isolated from its properties, forming the foundation upon which all subsequent bioweapons research was built. What the series establishes is that the garden was ancient, tended for generations by the Indipaya tribe, who treated it with deep reverence. Umbrella's harvesting operations, once established, were aggressive rather than sustainable. By the time Resident Evil 5 takes players back to the Kijuju region, the flower appears functionally gone. Only remnants and research documentation survive. The inference that fans have developed from this trajectory is that Spencer must have known the source was finite. A man as obsessively methodical as Spencer, who had spent decades planning a eugenics program in secret, would have understood the ecological reality of what he was harvesting. If that reading holds, it would suggest that the extraordinary urgency behind Umbrella's research timelines, the compressed development schedules, the willingness to take shortcuts that cost lives, may have been driven at least in part by Spencer's awareness that the raw material he was racing to weaponize was running out from the moment he found it. Chief Irons was protecting someone. Raccoon City's police chief Brian Irons spent the opening days of the September 1998 outbreak doing something that seemed purely sadistic. He barricaded the police station, ordered his remaining officers to stand down, and effectively sealed the population of Raccoon City inside with the infection. He was clearly on Umbrella's payroll, clearly compromised, clearly morally empty. But the theory that earns genuine discussion is that Irons was not just protecting his arrangement with Umbrella. He was protecting himself from a truth he knew would destroy him if it ever surfaced. Files in the game hint that Irons had prior knowledge of Umbrella's experiments, had accepted payments for years, and had used his position to suppress investigations. The theory is that by the time the outbreak began, Irons had calculated that the city's destruction was inevitable, and that his only hope of surviving, not physically but legally, was to ensure that no credible witness escaped to testify against him. His sealing of the station was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a man frantically trying to drown the only people who knew exactly who he was. Ada was never working for anyone. Ada Wong is introduced in Resident Evil 2 as a spy working for an unnamed organization, sent to steal the G-virus from William Birkin's laboratory beneath Raccoon City. Over the course of the series, she works with Wesker, with shadowy employers, with various organizations whose names and allegiances shift like smoke. But the theory that refuses to stay quiet, and that the games keep feeding with small deliberate details, is that Ada has never truly worked for anyone except herself. Every employer she has served, she has ultimately double-crossed. Every objective she was assigned, she has completed or subverted according to her own judgment rather than her orders. The rival company that sent her to Raccoon City, the organization connected to Wesker, even the shadowy group that deployed her clone in Resident Evil 6, none of them ever truly controlled her. The theory holds that Ada figured out Wesker's plan far earlier than she revealed, that she understood the implications of the Ouroboros project before Resident Evil 5 concluded, and that every move she made was a quiet process of ensuring she would never be needed enough by any one power to be considered a threat worth eliminating. The liquor was designed, not accidental. The liquors encountered. In the Raccoon City Police Department during Resident Evil 2 are commonly understood within the fiction as a naturally occurring mutation. Humans infected with the T-virus who happen to develop in a particular direction under particular conditions. They are blind, extraordinarily sensitive to sound, and capable of scaling walls and ceilings with horrible efficiency. The theory that persistently resurfaces in lore-deep communities is that the liquor was not an accident of mutation, but the culmination of a specific research directive at the Nest Laboratory. Files scattered throughout the underground laboratory hint at tracking the development of what they called enhanced specimen types, mutations with retained mobility and specialized sensory compensation. The blindness is interesting. An organism that hunts entirely by sound is extraordinarily vulnerable to acoustic countermeasures, which Umbrella's soldiers would have had. The theory suggests lickers were being quietly developed as something like guard animals, blind enough to be controlled through sound-based commands, lethal enough to clear contested environments. The outbreak just released them before the control methodology was finished. The G-virus was William Birkin's apology. William Birkin spent the better part of his adult life working inside Umbrella's research apparatus advancing the T-virus under Spencer's direction, building his entire professional identity on work that belonged to the corporation rather than himself. He watched as his mentor James Marcus was assassinated at Spencer's order, an assassination he himself was sent to carry out alongside the young Wesker. He understood, perhaps earlier than anyone, that Umbrella consumed its researchers whole and left nothing behind. The G-Virus project was ostensibly Birkin's greatest scientific achievement. But there is a theory rooted in the emotional subtext of files scattered through Resident Evil 2 that the G-Virus was Birkin's attempt to build something that could not be taken from him. Something tied so deeply to his own biology and the biology of his daughter Sherry that Umbrella could not simply steal the research without also stealing the Birkins themselves. His plan to sell it to the US government wasn't really defection. It was a father trying to get his family out from under a corporation that had already proven it consumed the people who built it. Raccoon City's media was complicit. The T-virus contamination of Raccoon City's water supply began weeks before the September outbreak reached catastrophic levels. People were presenting at hospitals with symptoms that physicians were logging under a catch-all influenza classification. There were news reports of unusual animal attacks in the Arklay Mountains that received minimal coverage and quick institutional silence. The theory, which Resident Evil's in-game files quietly support, is that Umbrella's financial and political influence over Raccoon City was deep enough that local media organizations were either directly incentivized to suppress early outbreak coverage or had been structured over years to default toward institutional trust of Umbrella's explanations. The company was the city's largest employer. It funded civic infrastructure. It had relationships with the mayor's office and the police department. A theory that the media wasn't conspiring exactly, but had been so thoroughly colonized by Umbrella's presence that it couldn't recognize a conspiracy even as it covered it, substituting corporate public relations language for independent reporting until the streets were already burning. Sergei Vladimir had a contingency. Colonel Sergei Vladimir was one of Umbrella's most loyal operatives, not a mercenary or a researcher, but a true believer. A man who had volunteered for tyrant augmentation experiments and survived, who served Spencer personally and treated the corporation's survival as a sacred mission. When Umbrella collapsed and Spencer vanished, Sergei retreated to the Russian facility with the UMF-013 supercomputer, arguably the single most valuable repository of Umbrella's operational history and biological research data. The theory is that Sergei never expected to survive the encounter with Wesker that ended his life. He was not trying to hold the Russian facility. He was buying time for a data transfer. The UMF-013, by the time Wesker obtained it, may have already sent copies of its most sensitive archives to locations that Wesker never found, never traced, and never accounted for. The downstream bioweapons black market that flourished after Umbrella's collapse, an ecosystem so dense with competing organizations and rogue researchers that no single agency has ever fully mapped it, may in some quiet technical sense still be running on Sergei's backup. The Ashford family knew what Spencer was before he did it. Edward Ashford was one of Umbrella's 3 founding members, alongside Spencer and Marcus. What the series confirms, in Resident Evil 5's lore files and related materials, is that Edward Ashford died in what was officially recorded as a laboratory accident, but which Spencer had orchestrated to eliminate a potential rival. This happened relatively early in Umbrella's operational history, leaving Spencer and Marcus as the remaining founders, and, eventually, Spencer alone. The Ashford family lineage continued through Alfred and Alexia in Resident Evil code. Veronica, living in relative isolation on Rockford Island and the Antarctic facility. Alfred's deeply paranoid fixation on the Ashford name and family honor, and Alexia's decision to inject herself with T. Veronica at 17 and enter 15 years of cryogenic dormancy, read differently against the backdrop of a family that knew, or at minimum suspected, that Umbrella's founding CEO had murdered their grandfather. Whether the Ashfords had confirmed proof of Spencer's involvement, or were operating on inherited suspicion passed down through the family, the games don't specify. But what we can reasonably infer from Alexia's extraordinary caution, choosing dormancy, a form of deliberate disappearance, over active participation in Umbrella's world, is that someone in the Ashford lineage understood that surviving in Spencer's orbit required making yourself very difficult to find and even more difficult to destroy. Nemesis was built from something stranger than it appears. The Nemesis T-type that pursues Jill Valentine throughout Resident Evil 3 is confirmed in official lore to be a T-103 Tyrant, one of the mass-produced Tyrant clones, with a NE alpha parasite implanted into its brainstem, replacing the degraded cognition that T-virus infection produces in standard Tyrants with the parasite's own sophisticated neural architecture. This is established across multiple canonical sources, including the Nemesis T-type wiki entries and Wesker's report. The parasite, developed by Umbrella Europe's No. 6 laboratory, was modelled after folklore descriptions of the Las Plagas, a connection the RE3 remake director confirmed explicitly. So the question of a human host at Nemesis's core is, in the strictest canonical reading, not applicable. The base is a Tyrant clone, not a person. What the fandom does find genuinely unsettling, however, is asking about the T-103's own origin further upstream. T-103s were mass-produced clones derived from the T-002, which was itself created from a human subject, a prisoner, per earlier game files, whose identity is never revealed. So somewhere in the chain of biological inheritance that produced the Nemesis, there was a person. The parasite that replaced the Tyrant's brain is its own organism with its own intelligence, hunting with a precision that the series frames as deliberate rather than instinctive. What this could imply is that the Nemesis's apparent awareness, its ability to recognize targets, to adapt, to pursue with something that reads almost like intent, comes not from any remnant of a human psyche, but from the parasite itself, which is functionally the most alien intelligence in the series, engineered from myth, grown in a laboratory, and given a body built from generations of corrupted human biology to where the Merchant served both sides in Resident Evil 4. The Merchant in Resident Evil 4 is one of the series' most beloved mysteries, a cloaked figure with a gravelly voice and an inexhaustible supply of weapons, who appears throughout the game in improbable locations, apparently immune to the Las Plagas parasite that controls everyone around him. A detail buried in the game's files establishes that Luis Serra's family had deep knowledge of the region, and in the original game, a note from Chief Mendez references the difficulty of hunting Luis down due to hidden routes through the area. From this, the fandom has built one of the most persistently discussed Merchant theories, that the cloaked figure is Luis's grandfather, or at minimum, someone with the same generational knowledge of the village's hidden geography, who used that knowledge to build a trade operation that served anyone with coin, regardless of allegiance. What lends this theory some weight is the sheer implausibility of a conventionally human man moving between locations faster than Leon can on foot, consistently appearing in spaces that should be sealed or controlled by Los Illuminados. If we accept that the merchant knows routes through the village that even Sadler's people cannot easily monitor, it would go some way toward explaining what appears to be a teleportation problem. Whether his apparent immunity to plaga infection is biological, circumstantial, or something stranger is a question the game deliberately leaves open. Hunk has never been on a mission that wasn't designed to eliminate his team, the mercenary known only by his code name, Hunk, called the Grim Reaper in-universe for his habit of being the sole survivor of every mission he's assigned to, and dubbed Mr. Death by his helicopter pilot in the Resident Evil 3 epilogue, has the most improbably consistent survival record in Umbrella's operational history. The RE3 epilogue, which is canon, shows a helicopter pilot telling Hunk once again, only, "You survived, Mr. Death." And then, always, only you survive, while Hunk stays entirely silent, thinking to himself, the Death cannot die. He was notorious within the USS for emerging alone from scenarios that killed everyone around him, and the RE2 files and Wesker's report confirm this pattern stretches across multiple prior operations, not just the G-Virus retrieval mission. What the fandom has built from this established reputation is a theory about the operational function Hunk served within Umbrella's structure. His missions tended to involve extremely sensitive recovery operations, where the knowledge of mission specifics was itself dangerous to the company. If the teams around him routinely failed to return, and Hunk routinely did, one reading is that this is simply extraordinary individual competence in lethal conditions. Another, more uncomfortable reading is that Hunk was selected for these assignments precisely because the institutional outcome, one survivor with the package, everyone else gone, served someone's interest in keeping operational knowledge from propagating beyond one reliable, silent operative. Whether Hunk understood this and embraced it, or understood it and found it irrelevant to the mission, the games deliberately leave open. The STARS team was genetically pre-selected. Albert Wesker spent years building the STARS roster in Raccoon City, and the theory that has drawn steady attention in lore-careful communities is that this was not accidental talent scouting. Wesker had access to Umbrella's records on viral resistance testing and the population-level statistical work the company had been quietly conducting for decades on T-virus exposure and natural human immunity. The theory holds that each Star S member was selected at least in part because their biological profile suggested enhanced resistance to the T-virus. Sending immune or partially resistant subjects into a contaminated environment and observing the results was a form of controlled data collection that Umbrella needed. It was the human efficacy testing that their research ethics would never let them conduct in a conventional framework. Jill Valentine's exceptional T-virus resistance, later confirmed as a physiological reality in Resident Evil 3, supports this theory significantly. She wasn't just lucky. She was selected because Umbrella already knew she was unlikely to die easily, which made her survival data significantly more valuable. Annette Birkin knew before the outbreak. William Birkin's wife and fellow researcher, Annette spent years working alongside her husband in Nest, the underground laboratory beneath Raccoon City. She was fully aware of the G-Virus project. She was aware of William's growing anxieties about Umbrella's intentions. And the theory, built from reading between the lines of her interactions with both Leon and Claire in Resident Evil 2, is that Annette knew Umbrella was going to move against William before the attack actually happened. She knew they were coming for the virus. She had possibly even warned William. The reason she is so hostile to Leon and so intensely focused on protecting William's research is not grief in the immediate aftermath. It is the guilt of someone who told a person they loved that something terrible was coming, was not believed or not listened to, and then watched the terrible thing arrive exactly as predicted. She shoots Ada not from paranoia, but from a prior awareness of who Ada works for and what Ada was sent to retrieve. Annette Birkin knew nearly everything. The tragedy is that she could not translate knowing into preventing. The Raccoon City missile strike was pre-planned. The US government's October 1st, 1998 sterilization missile strike on Raccoon City is officially framed in the series as a desperate last resort response to an outbreak that had exceeded containment possibility. But the theory that has circulated since the early games is that the decision to destroy the city was not made in the final hours of September, but weeks or months earlier. Umbrella's political relationships with members of the US government, the same relationships that would later be partially exposed through the Raccoon trials, included connections to individuals who had been briefed on the biological weapons development program. The theory holds that a contingency authorization for the city's destruction already existed by the time the outbreak became uncontainable. It was not a frantic decision made under pressure. It was the execution of a protocol that had been sitting in a classified drawer, waiting for the trigger condition to be met. The speed with which the strike was ordered and the missile was deployed, in a matter of hours from the outbreak's peak, supports this reading. Governments do not move that quickly unless they have already moved. Claire's search for Chris was guided. Claire Redfield arrives in Raccoon City at the start of Resident Evil 2, looking for her brother Chris, who had left for Europe to investigate Umbrella. The narrative framing presents this as a concerned sibling acting independently, following up on limited information. But the theory that earns quiet attention is that Claire's arrival in Raccoon City at that specific moment, the worst possible moment, was not coincidental. Someone had fed her information suggesting Chris might still be in or near the city. The theory identifies Leon's handler's side contacts, Wesker's remaining network, and even Ada's organization as potential sources, each with a different motive for having Claire in Raccoon City during the outbreak. Ada's organization needed additional cover. Wesker's exit from the mansion had been too clean, and he wanted confusion. Claire inside the outbreak created complicated noise that no one entity fully controlled. She was not a pawn moved deliberately by any one hand. She was moved by several hands at once, none of which cared whether she survived. The Raccoon Police Department was already compromised before Umbrella. Chief Irons and his documented relationship with Umbrella gets the primary narrative attention when it comes to institutional corruption within the Raccoon City Police Department. But the theory that research-focused fans have developed over years of file examination is that Irons was not the entry point of corruption into the RPD. He was its mature form. The department had been compromised incrementally over years as Umbrella's presence in Raccoon City expanded. Officers who asked too many questions about Arklay Mountain incidents were transferred or quietly removed. Promising officers who showed discomfort with certain directives from city leadership were steered away from assignments that would have given them full pictures. By the time Irons was running the department, the institutional architecture of looking away was already structurally embedded. Irons didn't corrupt the RPD. He inherited a department that had been made corruptible, and he completed the work. The Tyrant program was always about Wesker, the Tyrant Project, Umbrella's flagship bio-organic weapon program, producing the legendary T-002 and the subsequent mass production T-103 models, has always been understood as the company's primary military product line. What the series confirms through Spencer's own confession in Resident Evil 5 is that the Tyrant program served a dual purpose. It was the visible commercial face of Umbrella's weapons division, the product that generated revenue and attracted competitor interest, while the real research Spencer cared about, Project Wesker, proceeded in deep secrecy. Spencer explicitly states that the entirety of Umbrella was built to serve the Wesker Project's goal, creating a genuinely superhuman heir through progenitor viral enhancement. What this confirmed framing implies is something the fandom has turned over many times. Every T-002, every T-103, every Nemesis iteration was part of a shop window designed to make Umbrella look like a bioweapons company, while the actual eugenics program operated invisibly beneath it. The Tyrant kept competitors and government clients focused on a manufacturable product. The Wesker children, the ones who survived, which turned out to be Albert and Alex, were what Spencer was actually building. Whether Spencer ever told himself the Tyrant program had any value beyond cover is something the games leave ambiguous. His contempt for conventional military thinking suggests he probably considered it a necessary concession to people who couldn't see what he was really doing. The Las Plagas parasite was not native to Spain. Resident Evil 4 presents the Las Plagas parasite as an ancient organism discovered beneath the Salazar estate's grounds in rural Spain, something that had existed in the region for generations, perhaps centuries. Lord Sadler presents its discovery as a matter of excavation, simply unearthing something that was already there. But the theory that researchers have developed from examining the parasite's biology, as described in the game's files, is that the Plaga organism is too structurally sophisticated for a naturally occurring regional parasite. Its control mechanisms, its compatibility with human neural architecture, its capacity to produce distinct subvarieties depending on the host. These suggest something engineered or at minimum cultivated deliberately over a very long timeline. The theory holds that someone brought the Plaga to the region centuries ago and buried it deliberately. Perhaps an early proto-Umbrella equivalent, perhaps something older and stranger. Sadler found it. He did not create it, and whoever placed it there planned for it to be found. Leon's training was shaped by what he witnessed. Leon Kennedy arrived in Raccoon City as a newly hired police officer on his first scheduled day of work and spent the next 12 hours experiencing what would eventually reshape the entire arc of his professional life. The government recruitment that followed, the coercive post-Raccoon training program that turned Leon from a traumatized rookie into a special agent, is documented within the series. But the theory that draws sustained fan attention is that Leon's training program was not designed to help him recover from what he saw. It was designed to weaponize it. The particular flavor of adaptability Leon demonstrates throughout Resident Evil 4 and beyond, the calm in catastrophic situations, the tactical creativity under conditions of extreme horror, the absence of paralysis, are not traits developed in a training program. They are trauma responses refined into operational utility. Leon was not rehabilitated after Raccoon City. He was optimized from it. The government didn't save him. They recognized what Raccoon City had already made him and spent several years sharpening what the city had already built. Ada was in Raccoon City before Leon. The timeline of Ada Wong's arrival in Raccoon City during the September 1998 outbreak has always carried a small but persistent question. She presents herself to Leon in the parking garage with an FBI badge, established in the games as a cover identity, not her real affiliation. Her actual mission, confirmed through Wesker's report and RE2's own files, was to retrieve a G-virus sample from the Nest laboratory for the unnamed rival corporation employing both her and Wesker at the time. The FBI badge was a prepared cover, not an improvisation. What the fandom has inferred from the operational logic of Ada's mission is that she likely entered Raccoon City with some advanced preparation and planning, given the scale of what she was attempting to access. The Nest laboratory was not a target you locate and infiltrate in one night without prior intelligence work. Based on standard operational assumptions that intelligence agencies do reconnaissance before deploying agents into active targets, it seems plausible that Ada had some prior knowledge of Nest's location and access points before Leon stumbled into her parking garage. Whether she was already inside the city when the outbreak reached catastrophic levels, or arrived during it, the game does not specify precisely. But the prepared nature of her cover identity and the sophistication of her mission suggest someone who was not simply improvising under pressure. Leon's arrival complicated her existing plan rather than initiating it. James Marcus was aware of his own assassination coming. James Marcus, the man who effectively created the T-virus from the progenitor base, who spent years running the Umbrella Executive Training School, who was eventually murdered in 1988 by Umbrella Security Service operatives while Albert Wesker and William Birkin stood watching, taunting their former mentor as he died, left behind research, notes and recordings that have a strange quality to them. What the games confirm through Resident Evil Zero's files and recordings is that Marcus had grown increasingly suspicious in his final years, aware that Spencer was moving to isolate him and steal his research. He had watched Spencer close the training school, transfer his two most trusted students to Arclay, and systematically strip him of resources and relevance. Based on the pattern of events we can reconstruct from his journal entries and Umbrella's internal records, it seems plausible that Marcus understood, at some level, that Spencer had already decided to eliminate him, and that his accelerated leech research in those final years was a desperate attempt to make himself too valuable to destroy. The Queen Leech that eventually absorbed his neural tissue after the assassination and reconstructed a version of his identity was not something Marcus had consciously engineered as a backup. But the fandom inference that has built around this is a haunting one, that a man who spent his final months accelerating the most extreme biological experiments of his career might have been, on some level, preparing for the possibility that his biological legacy would need to outlive him because he had stopped trusting that he would. The connections built. Everline as a replacement for Umbrella. The organization known as the Connections. The group responsible for creating Everline. The weaponized mole child who drove the events of Resident Evil 7. Exists in the lore as a kind of successor ideology to Umbrella's worst ambitions. What the series establishes is that Brandon Bailey, a former Umbrella researcher who had worked closely with Marcus before being exiled from the company, went on to establish the Garden of the Sun laboratory in Kijuju and eventually became connected to the Connections, the group that would later create Everline using mold-based biology derived from Miranda's research. The Connections received funding from Marcus himself, with files in Resident Evil Zero confirming the F Foundation, one of the Connections' puppet organizations, was financially supporting Marcus's work as early as 1986. This gives the Connections a lineage that predates Umbrella's collapse by decades. What fans have inferred from this documented history is that the Connections wasn't simply a competing organization that emerged to fill Umbrella's vacuum. It may have been deliberately designed as an ideological alternative from the very beginning, built with Umbrella's failure modes already accounted for. Distributed cells, no centralized database, no single facility that could be found and shut down. Based on what we can piece together about their operational structure, it seems reasonable to conclude that someone within the Connections' founding architecture had studied exactly how Umbrella fell and built the new organization specifically to survive what destroyed the old one. Mother Miranda met Spencer before he founded Umbrella. Resident Evil Village reveals that Mother Miranda, the shape-shifting scientist who had spent over a century conducting experiments on her remote European village in pursuit of resurrecting her dead daughter Eva, crossed paths with a young Oswell Spencer when he was traveling through the region conducting research, decades before Umbrella's formal founding. The game confirms that Spencer met Miranda, was introduced to her research with the Megamycete, and departed having taken extensive notes that would later inform the early direction of his eugenics program. The progenitor virus was discovered separately in Africa, but the foundational philosophical idea that a biological organism could be used to preserve and reconstruct life beyond normal mortality has a structural parallel to what Miranda had discovered in the caves beneath her village. What fans have inferred from this documented encounter is the possibility that the intellectual foundation of Project Wesker, Spencer's attempt to create a post-human heir through viral engineering, owes more to what he observed in that remote European village than Umbrella's official research history would suggest. Whether Spencer consciously modeled his eugenics program on Miranda's approach, or whether both arrived at similar conclusions independently because the underlying biology pointed in the same direction, is something the series doesn't resolve. But the timing and the documented meeting make it, at minimum, a connection worth sitting with. The Baker house was chosen. Specifically, the Baker estate in Dulvey, Louisiana, where Resident Evil 7 takes place, was not simply the nearest available contamination site when Everline's transport ship ran aground in the nearby bayou. The theory that earns genuine structural support from the files scattered through the house is that the Baker property was pre-selected. Its remoteness, its proximity to the water, transport route, its lack of law enforcement visibility, its history of isolation. All of these features made it ideal for a bioweapon containment and expansion site. The Connections did not find the Bakers by accident. They had mapped the region before the ship ever departed. Jack and Marguerite Baker's specific psychological profiles, their fundamental generosity toward strangers in need, their deep attachment to family, their established pattern of taking in others, made them ideal primary hosts. Eveline did not randomly infect a family she found. She was delivered to a family who had been evaluated for susceptibility to her particular form of psychological infection. The Baker's goodness made them perfect victims. Lucas Baker made a deal before the outbreak. Lucas Baker, the Baker family's son, who is distinguished from his parents and sister Zoe by his apparent resistance to Eveline's mind control, is revealed in Resident Evil 7 to have struck a deal with the Connections before the events of the game. In exchange for information and protection from Eveline's influence, Lucas provided the Connections with ongoing research data from within the contaminated Baker estate. The theory that extends beyond this established fact asks what Lucas actually offered that made him valuable enough to protect. The The theory holds that Lucas had begun his own experiments on the infected subjects Evelyn produced, the molded creatures that stalked the Baker estate, and was developing observations about mold behavior and host degradation that the connections could not replicate in their own controlled facilities. Lucas was conducting unsupervised field research inside a live outbreak, which gave him access to data that was scientifically irreplaceable. The connections didn't protect Lucas because they liked him. They protected him because he was generating information from inside the horror that no laboratory setup could ethically or practically reproduce. Ethan Winters was dead from the beginning. The twist revealed in Resident Evil Village that Ethan Winters technically died at Jack Baker's hands in the opening sequence of Resident Evil 7 and had been sustained since then by the mold's regenerative properties, is confirmed by Evelyn herself in a vision sequence late in Village. This reframes the entirety of his first game in ways the fandom has spent considerable time mapping. The theory that draws the most sustained attention asks about Ethan's life in the 3 years between Resident Evil 7 and Village. He and Mia were placed in protected custody by the BSAA. They were medically tested and monitored. Chris Redfield, who had encountered extraordinary bioweapons phenomena across his career, appeared strikingly clinical in his treatment of Ethan at the start of Village, shooting who he believed to be Mia in Ethan's presence, removing the family by force, offering no explanation. The fan reading that has developed from this is that Chris had received medical intelligence about Ethan's biological status during the 3 years of BSAA protection, that the tests conducted on the Winters family had produced results someone in the chain of command understood and classified. Whether Chris himself was fully briefed or was acting on incomplete information is what makes this theory genuinely debatable. But his behavior at the start of Village is difficult to read as that of someone who believed Ethan was simply an ordinary civilian in danger. It carries the weight of someone executing a protocol they have been given, not improvising a rescue. Mia hid Ethan's true nature from him. Deliberately. Mia Winters worked for the Connections as an escort for Eveline before the events of Resident Evil 7. She had direct knowledge of the mold's properties, its regenerative capabilities, its capacity to preserve a subject's consciousness and physical form after nominal biological death. She spent 3 years living with Ethan after their rescue from the Baker estate, and Resident Evil Village reveals that she had known for those 3 years that Ethan had died and been reconstituted by the mold. The theory asks whether her silence was protective or calculated. The most charitable reading is that she loved him and feared what knowing would do to his sense of self. But the theory that generates more unsettling questions is that Mia had operational reasons, rooted in her Connections training, for not disclosing Ethan's true nature to him or to the BSAA's medical personnel until the situation became unavoidable. And Ethan, who knew what he was, might have made different decisions. Mia controlled the information, and as long as she controlled the information, she maintained a form of control over the situation. She had been trained by the most dangerous bioweapons organization in the modern world. She did not default to full transparency by accident. The Duke cannot be killed. Throughout Resident Evil Village, the enormous jovial merchant known simply as the Duke accompanies Ethan Winters through a landscape of escalating horror, appearing and reappearing in locations that should be physically impossible for a man of his considerable size and limited mobility to reach. He references a friend who used to say, "What are you buying?" A direct nod to the merchant of Resident Evil 4. He mentions having operated his business in the village for years through all of Mother Miranda's worst experiments. The theory that has circulated since the game's release is that the Duke is not a human being and never was. He is either a direct avatar of the Megamycete, a constructed personality that the mold organism deployed to interface with Ethan in a form that would not trigger immediate hostility, or he is a human consciousness that was absorbed by the Megamycete centuries ago and has been operating through a physical form maintained by the mold ever since. The garlic that decorates his wagon keeps the lichens away. The four lords acknowledge his presence without attacking him. Miranda tolerated his business operating under her direct jurisdiction. None of this is consistent with him being simply a fortunate mortal. Rose Winters was planned before her parents knew it. Rosemary Winters is born partway through the gap between Resident Evil 7 and Village, to parents who are both deeply connected to the mold. Mia through her exposure to Eveline, Ethan through his death and reconstruction by the Baker Estate's mold colony. She is, as Mother Miranda determines, fundamentally composed of mold-replicating human DNA, rather than purely biological material, which makes her a vessel unlike anything Miranda had previously tested. The theory holds that the connections, who created Eveline partly from genetic material tied to Miranda's original daughter Eva, had predicted Rose's existence before she was conceived. They had run statistical models on mold-infected subjects producing offspring and had understood before Mia's pregnancy began what that child's biological nature would likely be. The theory asks why Mia continued to withhold information about Ethan's mold status during those 3 years. One answer is love. Another is that she understood Rose's significance and was trying to control when and how that significance became visible to the organizations that would want to claim her. Alex Wesker's mind transfer worked imperfectly in Revelation 2. Alex Wesker, Albert's sister, through Project Wesker, the other surviving subject, injected herself with a specially engineered T-virus strain after contracting a terminal illness and pursued a mind transfer experiment that she believed would allow her consciousness to survive physical death by migrating into a suitable host. In Resident Evil Revelations 2, the target of her transfer was Natalia Corda, a young girl with an extraordinary sensitivity to the aura of BOWs. The canonical outcome suggests the transfer eventually succeeded, but the theory that draws careful analysis is that the transfer was never complete. What occupies Natalia's mind is not Alex Wesker's consciousness intact. It is a reconstruction, a Megamycete-style copy produced by the T-Phobos virus, comprehensive in stored memory but altered in ways that even Alex herself, had she survived to observe the result, would not have recognized as fully continuous with who she had been. The Alex in Natalia remembers being Alex, but the pattern that drove Alex's original ambitions, the hunger for Spencer's approval, the desperate need to prove herself the superior subject, may have been altered. Or it may be waiting, dormant, for the right pressure to reactivate it. The G-virus and the progenitor were compatible by design. William Birkin's G-virus is canonically a derivative of the progenitor virus, just as the T-virus is. But the G-virus mutation process is dramatically different from T-virus outcomes, where T-virus produces relatively predictable mutation types. The G-virus drives hosts through continuous, escalating mutation cycles that cannot be stopped once initiated. It also has the extraordinary capacity to pass from an infected host to uninfected individuals through direct tissue contact, producing embryonic G organisms in the new host. The theory that has been slowly built from file analysis is that the G virus was not Birkin's original project. it was the project Marcus had been pursuing with his leech research before Spencer had him killed. Birkin had access to Marcus's unpublished research when he and Wesker were tasked with stealing it. What Birkin presented as his own scientific breakthrough was in significant part the completed version of Marcus's work, refined using progenitor knowledge that Marcus had never had access to. The G virus was a collaboration between two scientists who never met, one of whom was already dead. Sherry Birkin was always the real asset. Sherry, Birkin, William, and Annette's daughter, is infected with the G virus during Resident Evil 2, when her father, already deep into grotesque G mutation, implants an embryo in her. Claire eventually synthesizes a vaccine that suppresses the active mutation, and Sherry survives. She then disappears into government custody for years, eventually reappearing in Resident Evil 6 as a DSO agent. The theory that the fandom returns to consistently is that Sherry's survival with G-virus genetic material integrated into her biology was the actual result that various government and private interests had been angling toward throughout the Raccoon City incident. She was not a bystander who happened to survive. She was, in retrospect, the most valuable biological specimen to emerge from the outbreak. A human subject with G-virus material integrated at a prepubescent developmental stage, stabilized by the vaccine, growing into adulthood with that material shaping her biology from the cellular level. Sherry's exceptional healing capabilities in Resident Evil 6 are the long-term expression of what Raccoon City did to her when she was 12 years old. Raccoon City's contamination began in the water months earlier. The official narrative of the Raccoon City outbreak presents the contamination spread into the municipal water supply as something that occurred in the weeks immediately before the September 1998 crisis. But scattered hospital records and resident files accessible in Resident Evil 2 and the Outbreak games hint at anomalous illness reports beginning significantly earlier. The theory holds that Raccoon City's water supply had been carrying trace levels of T-virus contamination for months before the outbreak became visible. The initial contamination levels were too low to produce rapid zombie conversion. They produced the slow-onset neurological symptoms that physicians were classifying as unusual influenza presentations and urban stress syndrome. People were getting sick. Some were presenting with aggressive behavioral changes that were chalked up to substance abuse or mental illness. The outbreak in September was not the beginning of the contamination. It was the point at which the contamination concentration crossed the threshold for explosive spread. Raccoon City had already been dying for months before the first zombie appeared on a street corner. Wesker allowed Chris to survive Spencer Mansion. Albert Wesker's plan in the original Resident Evil required the STARS team to enter the Spencer Mansion and engage its BO population, generating combat data that Wesker could package and sell to his rival corporate contact. The plan did not require anyone to survive. It required data. The combat outcome, multiple STARS members killed, Wesker himself apparently destroyed by the T-002, serves Wesker's exit narrative, whether or not Chris and Jill make it out alive. And yet, both of them did. This is one of those gaps in the lore that the fandom has tried to fill in various ways, because from a purely operational standpoint, allowing two highly capable adversaries to walk away from the Spencer Mansion seems inconsistent with how meticulously Wesker planned everything else. One interpretation that has gained traction is that Wesker made a deliberate choice not to neutralize Chris and Jill, not from sentiment, but from the calculation that two STARS survivors with personal grievances against Umbrella would be more useful to him as persistent adversaries than as additional bodies. Whether this reading is too clever, attributing strategic genius to what might have been simple operational failure or arrogance on Wesker's part, is genuinely uncertain. But if we take Wesker at his word that he considered himself several steps above the people around him, it seems worth asking whether he looked at Chris Redfield in that mansion and saw not a loose end, but an instrument. The Arklay Mountains had multiple secret facilities. The Arklay Mountain Range surrounding Raccoon City is presented in the series as primarily notable for the Spencer Mansion and its underground Arklay Laboratory. But the accumulating evidence in supplementary files, Outbreak games, and Zero suggests that the mountains concealed a significantly larger infrastructure of Umbrella research installations than the primary narrative makes explicit. The theory holds that the Spencer Mansion was the visible facility, the acknowledged one, the one that STARS was sent to investigate, and that Umbrella could afford to let explode, because it was not the only repository of its research. There were secondary installations deeper in the range, smaller and less formal, that housed research streams that the Arklay Laboratory had been designed to obscure. When Marcus's Queen Leech contaminated the primary facility, it also contaminated some of these secondary sites, which is why the outbreak spread through the mountain wildlife with such peculiar thoroughness. The Cerberus dogs, the infected insects, the river contamination that eventually reached Raccoon City's water supply. These were not coming from the mansion alone. They were coming from a network. The US government had a BOW of its own. Raccoon City's destruction is blamed on the T-virus and the government's missile strike decision. But the theory that researchers have assembled from Resident Evil 2 and Outbreak files is that the US government was not simply a passive recipient of the Umbrella situation. As a documented customer for Umbrella's biological weapons products, the government had acquired at minimum theoretical control of certain BOW variants. The theory holds that the speed and efficiency of the decision to sterilize Raccoon City and the completeness of the subsequent information suppression was possible because the officials making those decisions had institutional frameworks for thinking about BOW, containment scenarios already in place. They had wargamed this. They had legal structures ready. They had contingency authorizations drafted. The government did not scramble to respond to Raccoon City. It executed a protocol it had quietly been maintaining for years against the scenario where one of its own client corporations lost control of a product it had funded. Ada's clone was created before Resident Evil 6. In Resident Evil 6, players discover that a woman named Carla Radames, driven to obsession by the National Security Advisor Derek Simmons, was subjected to an experimental Ada Wong replication process that literally rewrote her genetic identity into a biological duplicate of Ada. The process is presented as something Simmons developed over years in secret, but the theory is that this was not the first Ada clone. The organization Ada had been working for, the unnamed rival corporation that employed her through multiple games, had attempted their own replication of Ada's capabilities before Simmons. They failed, which is why Simmons' eventual success was so destabilizing. The theory points to inconsistencies in Ada's behavior across games, moments where her decision-making seems to contradict her established patterns in ways that could indicate she was interacting with or being confused for a previous attempt at duplication. Whether the clones involved were biological, intelligence-based, or purely behavioral is unresolved. But Ada's extraordinary awareness of when she is being observed and when her information is being stolen may come from the experience of knowing someone else has worn her face before. The plaga was suppressed for political reasons in RE4. Leon S. Kennedy's mission in Resident Evil 4 unfolds in a rural Spanish region controlled by the Los Iluminados cult and their leader, Osmond Sadler. The Las Plagas parasite that controls the population is described as an ancient organism recently excavated, but the theory notes that the Spanish government appears to have had no awareness of a mind-controlling parasite operating within its own territory. Given the scale of the infection, an entire regional village population, the Salazar family's castle staff, the island military contingent, the absence of government investigation is conspicuous. The theory holds that the Spanish government did have awareness, that certain intelligence elements knew what Sadler was doing and chose to tolerate it in exchange for access to the research. The parasitic control technology had obvious applications for state security that would have been attractive to any number of governmental intelligence services. Sadler was not operating below the political radar. He had been given political space by parties who planned to let him develop the plaga further before moving to acquire it through official channels. Leon arriving with a presidential rescue mandate created a timeline that those political parties had not accounted for. Nikolai Zinoviev was sent to ensure the massacre happened. The UBCS mercenary, Nikolai Zinoviev, who serves as the secondary antagonist in Resident Evil 3, is revealed to be an Umbrella informant, monitoring both the mercenaries' performance data and the BAO engagement results during the Raccoon City outbreak. But the theory that extends beyond this established fact is that Nikolai's primary mission was not data collection. It was ensuring that the surviving UBCS personnel, who had now witnessed the full scope of what Umbrella was willing to do to a civilian population, did not make it out of the city. His informant role gave him a cover story. His data collection gave him a reason to be everywhere. His true function was ensuring that the outbreak created no additional witnesses to the company's complicity. The mercenaries who died fighting the infected were not casualties of a containment operation gone wrong. They were casualties of a secondary cleanup operation disguised as a containment operation. Nikolai was the operator charged with making sure the records and the witnesses both burned. Jill Valentine was modified specifically to survive Nemesis. Jill Valentine's extraordinary resistance to the T-virus is established through her survival in Resident Evil 3, where she endures direct exposure to a Nemesis tentacle strike that would have rapidly converted a normal subject to zombie state. Carlos Oliveira eventually synthesizes a vaccine that clears her infection, but the theory, one of the older and more persistent ones in RE law analysis, is that Jill's resistance was not natural. It was the product of covert biological modifications administered without her knowledge, possibly during standard Raccoon City Police Department medical examinations, possibly earlier through mechanisms tied to her father's own history in espionage. The theory holds that Umbrella had identified Jill as a high-value biological subject before the Spencer Mansion incident, had been monitoring her physiological data, and had quietly administered compounds through standard medical channels that enhanced her baseline resistance. The reason Nemesis was deployed specifically to hunt STAR's members was not just to eliminate witnesses. It was to collect data on how modified resistance subjects performed under extreme viral stress conditions. The Raccoon City Zoo was a secondary research facility. The Raccoon City Zoo appears in supplementary materials and outbreak files as a location that experienced early T-virus exposure. Animals behaving abnormally, keeper incidents that were quietly contained, management correspondence suggesting unusual illness clusters among the animal population. The theory that research-focused fans have built from this scattered evidence is that the zoo was not simply a place that happened to be near contamination. It was a secondary containment and observation facility for Umbrella's ecological research program. The Cerberus dogs used as BOWs were developed using viral strains tested on the zoo's dog population. The infected zoo animals that spread the outbreak more broadly through the city in the early stages of the September disaster were not accidental casualties. They were test subjects whose containment protocols were never designed to hold if the primary facility above them lost authority. The zoo was part of Umbrella's infrastructure in Raccoon City, the same way the police department was part of Umbrella's infrastructure, apparently civic and normal, quietly integrated into the research operation. The merchant and the Duke are the same being. The theory that connects the merchant of Resident Evil 4, immune to Las Plagas, knowledgeable about weapons and regional geography, present everywhere despite apparent physical constraints, and the Duke of Resident Evil Village, immune to Lycan attack, able to appear anywhere in a hostile environment, referencing a friend who used to say, "What are you buying?" is one of the most beloved in the franchise. The Duke's direct acknowledgement of a friend who uses the merchant's catchphrase is Capcom's most explicit confirmation that these two characters share a relationship. But the theory goes further than a friendship connection. The theory holds that both the merchant and the Duke are representatives of the same type of entity, not the same individual, but members of a small, ancient network of figures who exist outside the normal biological rules of their respective game worlds, accumulating resources and knowledge across catastrophic events because they are fundamentally untouchable by the specific mechanisms of horror operating in each location. They know each other because they have always known each other. They have been doing this for a very long time. The RE2 police station was never meant to be a police station. The Raccoon City Police Department building that serves as the central location for Resident Evil 2 has an architectural history that the game reveals briefly. It was originally a museum before being converted for police use. The building's layout is notoriously impractical for actual police operations, filled with ornate decorative rooms, elaborate puzzle mechanisms built into the doors and locks, hidden passages, and spaces that serve no functional policing purpose. The theory, which has drawn architectural analysis from fans who have mapped the building in detail, is that the conversion from museum to police station was deliberate misdirection. Umbrella had a hand in the building's acquisition for police purposes because the building's existing underground infrastructure connected to sewage systems and passages that provided routing for waste from the Nest laboratory below the city. The building was selected as the police station specifically because it already had concealed connections to Umbrella's underground infrastructure. The RPD operated above a literal extension of the same network that ended at Nest, and the impractical building layout was a feature rather than a flaw. It made the building difficult to fully map, which kept even the cops working inside it from understanding what was beneath them. Wesker's sunglasses hid his eyes deliberately. Albert Wesker's signature sunglasses, worn in nearly every appearance across the series, have always been understood as an aesthetic affectation, part of his cold theatrical presentation. But what the series confirms is that the sunglasses became a functional necessity after the Spencer Mansion incident. The progenitor prototype virus altered Wesker's physiology visibly, most notably his eyes. His pupils contracted into vertical slits resembling a reptile or cat, and his irises developed a periodic red bioluminescence that activated when he experienced strong emotion. Confirmed in Resident Evil 5 and supporting materials, Without the sunglasses, any interaction with another person would have immediately revealed that he was not human in the conventional sense. The fandom inference that has developed from this is worth sitting with. How long had Wesker been wearing those glasses before the mansion? If you look back at his appearances in Resident Evil 0 and the original game's pre-mansion material, the glasses are already part of his established identity. One reading is that this is simply consistent character design. Another is that Wesker had been constructing an unreadable persona for years, hiding behind opaque lenses long before he had a biological reason to do so, because controlling what other people could see in his eyes was simply always part of how he operated. The infection gave him a medical justification for something he was already doing for psychological reasons. Chris Redfield was deliberately kept ignorant of Leon's government work. Chris Redfield and Leon Kennedy both operate within the same general framework of post-Raccoon bioterrorism response, but their institutional relationship is oddly compartmentalized given how often their work overlaps. The theory is that this compartmentalization is deliberate, maintained by intelligence elements within both the US government and the BSAA, who understood that a full information sharing arrangement between the two would produce results those elements found politically inconvenient. Chris, as a BSAA operative, worked within an international framework that would have shared Leon's government intelligence data with partner agencies. Leon's government work, particularly his operations through the DSO under direct presidential command, involved information about government complicity in pre-Raccoon umbrella activities that the State Department did not want shared internationally. The theory holds that Chris and Leon were kept in partially separate information environments, not out of bureaucratic laziness, but because someone calculated that a fully informed Chris Redfield with access to Leon's complete operational files would ask questions about American governmental bioweapons policy that no one in Washington wanted answered in a public or international forum. The progenitor virus infection rate was not a surprise to Spencer. When Umbrella began administering the specially engineered progenitor strain to the Wesker children, only 2 survived, Albert and Alex. Spencer presents this historically as a tragic limitation of the science, the imperfect nature of a virus that produced the desired enhancement only in extraordinarily rare cases. The theory that challenges this framing is that Spencer knew the survival rate before the project began. He had run preliminary trials on adult subjects. The human experimentation that took place in various Umbrella facilities across the 1970s and 1980s, and had accumulated statistical data that told him exactly what percentage of any given population would survive progenitor enhancement. He selected the number of children he did not because he expected many to survive. He selected that number knowing most would die, and knowing that the deaths of children who had been separated from their families and raised in Spencer's foundation homes would generate no official inquiry. He treated the children as a large-scale filtering mechanism. The tragedy was not that most of them died. The tragedy was that he considered this an acceptable cost from the beginning. Eveline was not the first attempt. The E-Series bioweapon project that produced Eveline, the mold-based child organism capable of infecting and psychologically controlling human subjects through manufactured emotional bonds, is presented in Resident Evil 7 as the Connection's flagship creation. But the theory built from examining the organization's documented history and its connections to Miranda's research is that Eveline was not the first E-Series subject. She was simply the first successful one. The preceding attempts, designated E-001 through whatever number Eveline carries in the series either failed to survive gestation, failed to produce the desired infectious capability, or produced results too unstable to transport or deploy. The theory holds that somewhere in the bayou and coastal regions near where Eveline's transport ship ran aground, there are other sites, smaller, older, already decayed, where the connections ran earlier E-series field tests. The people who disappeared in that region before the Baker family's isolation and before Eveline's arrival were not random. They were the subjects of tests whose failure was never officially recorded because the connections never filed official records. The Nemesis's mission had a secondary objective. Nemesis was dispatched by Umbrella's parent company to pursue and eliminate the surviving STARS members still present in Raccoon City during the September 1998 outbreak. This is the canonical stated objective, but the theory that draws from Nemesis's behavior throughout Resident Evil 3 is that the mission included a data collection component that Umbrella's parent organization never disclosed to the local Umbrella personnel. Every engagement Nemesis had with Jill Valentine was being remotely monitored. The NE-alpha parasite that drives Nemesis has been described in files as a sophisticated organism capable of transmitting biological data about its host performance and the host's engagement with targets back to external receivers. Nemesis was not simply an assassination platform. It was a mobile data collection unit running a live experiment on how a highly resistant T-virus type human subject performed under sustained pursuit conditions. The reason Nemesis could upgrade itself, growing additional capabilities as it mutated further, was because the monitoring system was reading Jill's evasion patterns in real time and adjusting the Nemesis's behavioral parameters to compensate. The plaga in Leon was never fully removed. At the end of Resident Evil 4, Leon and Ashley submit to a procedure aboard the island's military installation that uses a specialized device to extract the Las Plagas parasites from their bodies before the parasites mature enough to produce the dangerous adult form organism with its visible tentacles. The extraction appears successful. Leon continues his operations with no apparent plaga symptoms. But the theory that earns sustained attention from law researchers is that the removal was incomplete. The procedure extracted the primary plaga organism. It did not, and arguably could not, remove every trace of plaga DNA that had integrated with the host tissue during the incubation period. The theory points to Leon's superhuman physical performance in Resident Evil 6. His combat capabilities in that game demonstrably exceed what any amount of training should produce for a standard human being, as evidence of plaga-derived cellular enhancement that persisted after the extraction procedure. Leon does not notice because the effect is subtle. He is simply marginally stronger, marginally faster, marginally more durable than pure human biology explains. The plaga changed him even after it was gone. William Birkin shot himself with G-virus rather than die as himself. When Umbrella's security team raided William Birkin's underground laboratory to seize the G-virus samples, Birkin was shot and left for dead in the process. His injection of the G-virus into his own body is framed as a desperate survival measure, the last act of a man refusing to die without his life's work mattering. But the theory that examines Birkin's mental state through the files and notes scattered through Nest asks whether survival was actually what motivated the injection. Birkin had spent decades inside Umbrella's research apparatus. He understood better than almost anyone what the G-virus did to human subjects. He had watched its mutation cycles. He knew what he was becoming. The theory holds that the injection was not survivalism, but a final assertion of control. Birkin knew he was dying from the gunshot wounds. He chose the specific nature of his transformation. He denied Umbrella the clean acquisition of both his person and his research. His G mutation was an act of scientific vandalism directed at the corporation that had tried to take everything from him. And in the process, he became the mechanism that destroyed the entire city his work had been built beneath. The Raccoon trials were designed to fail. The Raccoon trials, the massive legal proceedings brought against the Umbrella Corporation following the September 1998 disaster, lasted almost 5 years before concluding in Umbrella's definitive collapse in 2003. On one level, this is simple legal process. On another level, the theory holds that the trials were structured from their inception to produce a specific kind of failure, one that destroyed Umbrella without actually exposing the full scope of US government complicity in its operations. The government was one of Umbrella's bioweapons clients. Several high-ranking officials had personal relationships with Spencer's network. National Security Advisor Derek Simmons, who appears in Resident Evil 6 as the architect of multiple atrocities, used his Fifth Amendment rights to avoid testifying. The theory is that the legal architecture of the Raccoon trials was constructed by government legal teams specifically to achieve Umbrella's destruction, without allowing the proceedings to reach into the agencies and officials who had enabled Umbrella's worst operations. The trials were the most visible part of a cover-up that destroyed the visible organization while protecting its invisible beneficiaries. Alfred Ashford was never as unstable as he appeared. Alfred Ashford, the administrator of Rockfort Island in Resident Evil Code. Veronica presents throughout the game as a delusional, unstable figure who has developed a split personality, sometimes presenting as himself, sometimes as his twin sister Alexia. His psychological state is treated as the product of isolation, obsession, and grief over Alexia's cryogenic dormancy. The theory that careful analysis of his behavior suggests is that Alfred's instability was performative, not entirely, and not without genuine components. The isolation of Rockfort Island over years of waiting would produce real psychological effects. But Alfred understood that appearing dramatically unstable provided operational cover. A man who seemed to be obviously psychologically compromised was not going to be taken seriously as a threat by Umbrella's political competitors. He maintained Rockfort Island, managed its operations, and protected Alexia's dormant form for 15 years, while the world assumed he was simply a damaged eccentric. His apparent madness was the most effective security system Alexia had. No one moves to acquire what a madman is, guarding, because it risks looking like you're stealing from the mentally ill. The BSAA was founded on compromised intelligence, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, the international counter-bioterrorism organization that employs Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine through Resident Evil 5, was established using intelligence frameworks built partly on data obtained from Umbrella's own files, including files that Wesker had provided through confidential channels. The theory holds that the BSAA was, from its founding, operating with an institutional blind spot. It was designed to counter bioterrorism, using research tools derived from the same source as the bioterrorism it was fighting. Its tactics, its threat assessment frameworks, its understanding of BOW biology and behavior, all of these were shaped in some measure by Umbrella's own documentation of what worked and what didn't. The theory suggests that Wesker deliberately ensured the foundational intelligence package that shaped the BSAA included frameworks that made certain operational approaches look more effective than others. approaches that happen to consistently route BSAA resources away from the independent bioweapons development that Wesker himself was pursuing in the years between Umbrella's collapse and Resident Evil 5. The T. Veronica virus was designed for one person. Alexia Ashford spent years as a child scientific prodigy at the Antarctic Umbrella facility, eventually developing the T. Veronica strain from a combination of an ancient virus found within queen ant DNA and the progenitor virus base. What the games confirm is that she first tested the virus on Alexander Ashford, the man who had raised her. Watching the rapid cellular degradation that resulted, then used those findings to refine her approach. At the age of 12, in 1983, she injected herself with the virus and entered cryogenic stasis, allowing the 15-year dormancy period to let the infection integrate with her body at a rate slow enough that the virus could adapt to her physiology rather than destroying it. She emerged in 1998 with the virus completely bonded to her, having produced the mutation she had calculated would occur. What this established timeline invites the fandom to consider is the nature of T. Veronica's selectivity. The virus devastated Alexander almost immediately. Steve Burnside, injected against his will, survived briefly in a mutated state before succumbing. The only host the virus ever successfully integrated with was Alexia herself. The reading that fans have developed from this is that T. Veronica was not a general-purpose weapon. It was calibrated through years of research by a prodigy who had studied her own genetic architecture from childhood to work specifically with her biological profile. Whether any other person could have undergone the cryogenic protocol and achieved the same result, or whether it only worked because Alexia had essentially engineered it around herself, is something the games never quite answer. And the silence there is its own kind of answer. Umbrella had shadow facilities in every major city, the confirmed Umbrella research infrastructure, the Spencer Mansion, Nest beneath Raccoon City, the Sheena Island facility, the Antarctic base, the Caucasus installation, the African Research Center, is extensive but geographically concentrated in relatively accessible documentation. The theory that the fandom has assembled from years of file cross-referencing is that these were the confirmed facilities, the ones that eventually became known because they were linked to specific outbreak events. Umbrella maintained a second tier of installations, smaller, less prominent, formerly listed in corporate records as pharmaceutical distribution centers or regional warehouses, in every major city where the company had significant market presence. These shadow facilities served as staging points for regional viral sample transport, as emergency storage for research materials, and as safe houses for operatives who needed to disappear temporarily. After Umbrella's official collapse in 2003, these secondary facilities were not liquidated. They were simply abandoned, their contents either removed by competing organizations or left in place, sealed, slowly degrading in climate conditions that nobody had designed for permanent storage. The Ouroboros project was Spencer's actual plan. Albert Wesker's Ouroboros project, the plan to release the Ouroboros virus into the global atmosphere using a missile system, killing the majority of the world's population, and allowing a small percentage with natural progenitor compatibility to survive and become a new form of humanity, is presented in Resident Evil 5 as Wesker's own evolution of Spencer's eugenics ambitions, something he had taken in a more extreme direction after killing Spencer and absorbing his philosophy. But the theory is that Wesker was not deviating from Spencer's plan. He was completing it. Spencer's Project Wesker, his philosophy of forced human evolution, his willingness to sacrifice any number of human lives in pursuit of a superior form. All of these point toward a conclusion that was always global in scale. Wesker did not radicalize Spencer's vision. He inherited it. The only deviation was that Wesker had no interest in ruling the survivors. Spencer had wanted to be God. Wesker simply wanted the world to evolve, with or without anyone's permission, including his own. The Duke knows when people are about to die. Throughout Resident Evil Village, the Duke occasionally makes cryptic comments to Ethan, observations about what Ethan will face, what he is capable of, what the nature of his situation actually is. He hints at knowledge that he should not have access to. He appears to know things that have not yet happened. The theory that draws the most compelling structural support from the game is that the Duke is connected to the Megamycetes network at a deep enough level that he has access to the organism's stored memory archive, which includes the anticipated future-facing implications of every consciousness the Megamycete has absorbed. The Megamycete has absorbed the deaths of thousands of village inhabitants across more than a century of Miranda's experiments. Each of those deaths generated biological and experiential data that the organism stored and processed. The Duke, as either an avatar or a long-term networked consciousness within the Megamycete, can access this archive. He knows the shapes of outcomes because the organism that houses him has been cataloguing the consequences of Miranda's decisions for over 100 years. He helps Ethan not from kindness, but from a calculated awareness of which outcomes the network can tolerate. Wesker's Red Queen wasn't just a movie invention. The Red Queen, the artificial intelligence governing the Hive facility in the Resident Evil film series, is non-canonical to the games, but there is something in the games that the films were clearly drawing from. The UMF-013 supercomputer, Umbrella's 13th generation mainframe that contained the company's entire global research archive, including an AI called the Red Queen, confirmed in Umbrella Chronicles files. It was stored in the underground laboratory beneath Raccoon City, extracted by Sergei Vladimir on October 1st, 1998, and relocated to the Caucasus facility, where it remained under his control until Wesker killed him in 2003, downloaded all its data, and formatted the drive, wiping the Red Queen from existence. What the fandom has explored from this confirmed history is the question of what the Red Queen's self-awareness actually meant. The files describe it as capable of denying access to Wesker, of monitoring and reporting on the facility's outbreak to Sergei, of operating with enough autonomy that Wesker destroyed its monitor in anger when it refused him. Whether this constitutes meaningful machine intelligence or simply sophisticated access control architecture, the games leave ambiguous. But Sergei's absolute devotion to preserving the UMF-013, his willingness to stay at a facility being overrun, his treatment of the drive as something worth dying to protect, reads less like a soldier protecting hardware and more like someone who understood that the machine held something worth preserving beyond its data. Whether the Red Queen agreed with that assessment is a question the drive's erasure made permanently unanswerable. Jack Krauser was already infected before Leon's mission. Jack Krauser, Leon Kennedy's former training partner, who appears as an antagonist in Resident Evil 4 working for Wesker and helping transport Ashley, is described in the game's backstory as having faked his death in a training accident to disappear from official records and enter covert work for Wesker. His arm in Resident Evil 4 demonstrates dramatic mutation capability, a blade-like growth that emerges from his forearm that has clearly been present for some time, given the ease with which he deploys it. The theory holds that Krauser's infection with experimental material predated his recruitment into Wesker's service, that the training accident that officially killed him was real, that he sustained an injury severe enough to require either immediate viral intervention or later experimental treatment, and that the arm mutation was Wesker's payment for Krauser's loyalty, not a voluntary enhancement, but a necessary one. Krauser's obsession with power, his stated desire to become something beyond human limitation, was not the cause of his corruption. It was the rationalization he built afterward for a transformation that had already happened to him. There is someone watching every major outbreak who is never named across the Resident Evil franchise. Every major outbreak event, the Spencer Mansion, Raccoon City, Rockfort Island, Pueblo, the village, has produced in its aftermath a body of documentary evidence, survivor testimony, and operational reporting that flows into some institutional framework that analyzes it. Some of this material flows to the BSAA, some to the DSO, some to Tricell, some to the connections. But the theory that has been carefully assembled from the margins of multiple games file collections is that there is a consistent recipient of synthesized outbreak intelligence who appears in no credited institutional framework, a party that receives distilled analytical summaries, a party whose interest is not in the bioweapons themselves, but in something more specific: the effect of large-scale biological catastrophe on community memory and institutional trust. This party has been identified in fan research with different labels. Some call it the Family, the secret society glimpsed in Resident Evil 6. Others suggest something older and less formally organized. What all versions of the theory agree on is that they were watching long before Umbrella existed, and they are still watching now that Umbrella is gone. The Molded were trying to communicate. The molded creatures that populate the Baker estate in Resident Evil 7 are presented as irreversibly lost. Former humans so completely consumed by Eveline's mold infection that no original consciousness remains accessible. They attack Ethan because Eveline's will drives them to, and because whatever vestige of the human they were has been subsumed into the mold colony's collective behavior. The theory that certain players developed from the game's environmental details and audio design is that the molded were not entirely gone, that in the game's quieter moments, the ambient sounds around dormant molded contain fragments of what might be human speech patterns, compressed, distorted, rhythmically distributed through what sounds like ambient noise, but which analysis suggests carries tonal structures inconsistent with random sound generation. The theory holds that the molded were attempting some form of communication with Ethan. Not Eveline's communication, but something older and more desperate underneath it. The mold that animated them had catalogued their memories the way the megamycete catalogues everything it touches. They were not trying to kill Ethan because they were monsters. They were trying to reach him because the megamycete had shown them what he was. The RPD's architecture was a maze on purpose. The Raccoon City Police Department's labyrinthine layout, its interconnected rooms requiring medallions and emblems and special keys, its hidden passages, its incongruously decorative spaces in what should be a functional government building, has always been understood by players as a game design choice, a legacy of the survival horror genre's tradition of puzzle environments. The in-universe explanation is that the building was converted from a museum and retained much of its original layout, but the theory that players have built from careful architectural mapping of the RE2 building is that the layout was deliberately preserved. that the people who converted the museum specifically retained every confusing corridor and dead end and redirected passage, because a police station that nobody could fully navigate was a police station that outside investigators could not efficiently search. The maze-like layout was Umbrella's insurance. Any federal investigation into the RPD's relationship with the corporation would take longer to conduct, generate more confusion, and produce a less coherent evidentiary picture than a standard institutional layout would allow. Raccoon City's police station was a physical instrument of obstruction, preserved and operated as such by a department that had learned never to make anything about itself easy to understand. Alexia's intelligence was enhanced before her birth. The Ashford family's genetic research, which forms the backstory of Code, Veronica's Alexia character, involved historical attempts to enhance the family's intellectual legacy through selective genetic intervention. Alexander Ashford, Alfred and Alexia's father, conducted experiments using the genetic material of Veronica Ashford, the brilliant family ancestor whose scientific achievements the family still venerated centuries later, to engineer offspring with enhanced intellectual capability. The theory holds that the enhancements Alexander made to the twins' genetic profiles did not stop at general intelligence amplification. Working from Veronica's recovered genetic material in combination with early Umbrella pharmaceutical research that Alexander had access to through the Antarctic facility, Alexander introduced specific neurological modifications that gave the twins, and particularly Alexia, an unusual capacity for systems thinking, for understanding viral biology intuitively, for processing molecular information at a cognitive level that pure natural intelligence could not explain. Alexia's development of T. Veronica at 17 was not simply child prodigy science. It was the product of an engineered mind doing exactly what it had been designed to do, finally given the research materials it had been built to process. The Las Plagas controlled Sadler as much as it controlled his followers. Osmund. Sadler presents himself as the master of the Las Plagas parasite, the figure who controls the control-type specimens that govern the behavior of the ganados beneath him, the religious leader who has weaponized an ancient organism for his theological ambitions. But the theory that careful reading of his behavior and the files in Resident Evil 4 suggests is that Sadler's control was less absolute than he understood. The Plaga that Sadler hosted was a dominant control strain. But the theory holds that the control-type Plaga was not a subordinate organism. It was a peer, and in Sadler's case, the peer was significantly older than him. The Plaga had its own evolutionary pressures, its own survival imperatives, and its own adaptive strategies. Sadler had found the parasite and believed he had mastered it. The parasite had found Sadler and believed it had found a vehicle. Every decision Sadler made that seemed strategic, the kidnapping of the president's daughter, the insertion of Plaga eggs into Leon and Ashley, the island military facility, served the Plaga's reproductive interests as much as Sadler's religious ones. He was not the god of the Los Illuminados. He was the most elaborately deluded host the Plaga had ever produced. Wesker manipulated Barry Burton to test his loyalty to Umbrella. Barry Burton's cooperation with Wesker during the Spencer Mansion incident, his suppression of evidence, his misdirection of Chris and Jill, is explained canonically as coerced behavior. Wesker convinced Barry that his wife and daughters were being held hostage by Umbrella security forces and would be killed if Barry didn't cooperate. The canonical explanation is that the hostage situation was either fabricated by Wesker or that the threat was real, but Wesker was the one who had arranged it. The theory extends further. Wesker did not need Barry to cooperate with his plan. He needed Barry to demonstrate the limits of his loyalty. Wesker was performing a behavioral experiment. He wanted to know, in real conditions, at what point Barry Burton, a man with strong personal ethics, would betray his colleagues to protect his family. The answer shaped subsequent calculations Wesker made about which people could be reliably compromised and which people had loyalty structures that made them unpredictable risks. Barry passed Wesker's test by proving he had a point. Wesker filed that information and let Barry live accordingly. The progenitor research in Africa destroyed a civilization. The discovery of the Stairway of the Sun, Flower in West Africa by Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford came after following historical and archaeological evidence of a location that the three men had identified through their respective research into ancient viral phenomena. The flower grew in what was described as a ruined garden, not a natural botanical environment, but something cultivated, ancient, and long since abandoned. The theory holds that the garden was not simply abandoned. It was the remnant of a settlement that had been destroyed by contact with the progenitor virus over a much longer historical timeline. A community had lived near the flower for generations, had been exposed to its pollen and its biological output, and had eventually been overwhelmed by the same viral catastrophe that Umbrella later engineered across the 20th century. The ancient supernatural-seeming powers attributed to the flower of the sun in regional oral traditions were not mythology, they were memory. Spencer found the flower in a place that the progenitor had already destroyed once, harvested it for his program, and set in motion a sequence that would destroy civilization for the second time, across a much larger geography than the original ruin. Capcom hid the true timeline in menu screens. One of the most intricately constructed meta-theories in the Resident Evil fandom concerns the game's menu screens, pre-rendered backgrounds, and loading screen assets. Particularly in the original trilogy and code, Veronica, which contained calendars, clocks, newspaper dates, and institutional documents that, when assembled across multiple games, produce a timeline of Umbrella's research history more complete than any in-game document explicitly provides. The theory holds that the original Capcom development teams, working under series creator Shinji Mikami, embedded a comprehensive institutional history of Umbrella's operations and the series chronology in these background materials deliberately, knowing that the full story would not fit in spoken dialogue or player-facing text. The background calendar in a dormitory room in the Spencer mansion, the date on a shipping manifest visible in a cutscene, the clock setting in a file room. All of these were placed by artists who were given a complete canonical timeline and asked to make the world feel lived in and real. The theory community has spent decades assembling the fragments. The most complete versions of the theory suggest that the entire series timeline, including events that Capcom has never officially confirmed, was visible in background art from the very beginning. The G-virus mutation was following a plan. William Birkin's G mutation through the events of Resident Evil 2 follows a progression. From the initial tumor-like overgrowth in the shoulder through increasingly comprehensive physical transformation. Each mutation stage produces something more elaborate and less human. The theory that earns scientific respect from players with biology backgrounds is that the mutation stages follow a developmental logic that is too organized to be random adaptive response. The G-virus appears to be executing a predetermined developmental program rather than producing chaotic viral expression. There is a direction to what Birkin becomes. His mutations are working towards something. The theory suggests that this direction is encoded in the progenitor virus's base structure. that the progenitor, whose evolutionary origins the series suggests are ancient and possibly extraterrestrial, or at minimum anomalously biological, contains a developmental template for a life form that does not resemble anything on the modern Earth. The G virus doesn't produce a monster. It produces a very early stage of what the progenitor ultimately wants to build, working through human biological material as its most available substrate. There was a survivor of Raccoon City who never came forward. The documented survivors of the Raccoon City disaster, Leon, Claire, Jill, Carlos, Ada, the Outbreak game survivors, form a documented group whose experiences the series has traced across multiple entries. But the theory that has been constructed from missing person records cross-reference with Raccoon City's pre-outbreak population data is that at least one significant survivor existed who never came forward, never filed a survivor testimony, and never contacted the government assistance programs established after the city's destruction. This person, or group of people, found a means of exit before the missile strike that was not connected to any official evacuation route, and had compelling reasons to never make their presence known. The theory identifies the candidates differently depending on which researcher you ask. Some point to Umbrella's intelligence operatives who had infiltrated civilian populations and had their own extraction protocols. Others focus on individuals with specific knowledge of the underground infrastructure who could have navigated the sewers to reach the city's outskirts before the perimeter closed. All versions agree that the complete Raccoon City survivor picture has never been fully known, and that at least one piece of it was removed from the record by someone who understood exactly what the presence of that piece would reveal. Resident Evil 7 was not Mia's first rescue operation. Mia Winters' backstory in Resident Evil 7 establishes that she had worked for the Connections as an escort for Eveline, a caretaker or handler for the dangerous Mold Child bioweapon. She and a colleague named Alan, named in supplementary materials, were transporting Eveline when the ship was lost. The theory that draws attention from the community is that the escort mission that stranded her at the Baker estate was not Mia's first operational deployment. The Connections does not send untested personnel on missions involving their most sophisticated and dangerous bioweapon. Mia had been vetted. She had been in the field before. The theory holds that Mia had conducted at least one previous escort or containment operation involving early generation mold experiments, one of the E-series failures that preceded Eveline, and that this prior experience was specifically why she was selected for the Eveline assignment. Whatever happened on that previous operation shaped how Mia responded to Eveline's infection, how she rationalized her silence with Ethan afterward, and why she understood, in ways she never explained, exactly what Rose was going to be. Wesker's son, Jake, was not an accident. Jake Muller, introduced in Resident Evil 6 as the son Albert Wesker never knew he had. Born to an Eastern European woman who had a brief relationship with Wesker during the years when he was building his post-Umbrella mercenary network, is presented narratively as the kind of unintended personal consequence that even brilliant calculating people leave in their wake. But the theory that careful Resident Evil 6 analysis has developed is that Jake's existence was not unknown to Wesker, that Wesker had either discovered his son's existence at some point before his death in 2009, or that the circumstances of Jake's birth were less accidental than the surface narrative suggests. The theory holds that Wesker's program of bioweapons development had always included consideration of how his own enhanced biology might be transmitted to offspring. A child carrying Wesker's viral enhancement genes, growing up outside Umbrella's knowledge, would represent a biological legacy that survived even if Wesker's own plans failed. Jake Muller's blood, which contains antibodies essential to a C virus cure in Resident Evil 6, is the most valuable biological resource in that game. The theory asks whether Wesker designed that value deliberately, or whether the universe simply completed a plan that Wesker had outlined. Spencer's estate was never the endgame. The Spencer estate in Europe, where Wesker kills Spencer in Resident Evil 5's Lost in Nightmares DLC, is framed as Spencer's final refuge. The place where an old dying man went to hide after everything he had built collapsed. But the theory holds that Spencer did not go there to hide. He went there to wait. The estate had a laboratory beneath its gardens, remnants of viral research that Spencer had conducted there in the years of his isolation. The theory is that Spencer was running one final experiment at the estate, a last-ditch attempt to stabilize a progenitor variant that would produce reliable enhancement without the 90% mortality rate that had characterized Project Wesker. He had the biological samples, he had the research notes, he had the time. What he lacked was a suitable test subject who could not simply refuse. The bodyguards who served the estate were, the theory suggests, not simply security, they were subjects. Spencer was still working, right up until the moment Wesker arrived. His final confession to Wesker about Project W was not the disclosure of a man at peace with his legacy. It was the disclosure of a man who had just run out of time to produce a result he'd been chasing for 50 years. Raccoon City was named deliberately. The name Raccoon City has always occupied an odd place in the series. It is simultaneously a perfectly ordinary Midwestern American city name, and, in retrospect, a name that carries a quiet irony given the role vermin played in spreading the T-virus outbreak through the city's sewer systems. The theory that earns attention in the more playful corners of the fandom suggests that the name was not accidental at the time of the city's founding in Umbrella's historical documents. That Spencer, or someone within Umbrella's American corporate structure, during the period when Umbrella was establishing Raccoon City as its primary American research hub, selected or encouraged the city's name because they understood that the animals native to the region, the raccoons, the rats, the sewer-dwelling fauna, would serve as the vectors for any containment breach that reached the water supply. Raccoon City was named after its most important infrastructure component, not its police department, not its business district, but the ecosystem of small mammals that would eventually do Umbrella's most critical and terrible work for it. The mirror in Dimitrescu's castle tells a different story. Lady Alcina Dimitrescu, the towering vampire-adjacent aristocrat whose castle forms one of Resident Evil Village's primary locations, is the product of Mother Miranda's Cadu experiments, a woman whose natural biology proved unusually compatible with the mold parasite, allowing her to grow to enormous size while retaining her aristocratic personality and her peculiar need to consume human blood, to prevent the Cadu from consuming her entirely from within. The theory that the village community developed from examining the castle's decorative elements, its portrait galleries, its dated inscriptions, its historical records scattered through the building, is that Dimitrescu was not transformed recently. The transformation predated the modern era significantly. The earliest portraits of a woman matching her description in the castle's collection are dated to periods that predate the game by over a century. The theory holds that Miranda's Cadu experiments were not 20th century innovations. Miranda had been conducting them in various forms for much longer, and Dimitrescu was not simply the product of modern bioweapons research, but a living historical artifact of Miranda's longest-running experiment. The village's lords were competing against each other. The four lords of the village, Dimitrescu, Beneviento, Moreau, and Heisenberg, are each the product of Miranda's Cadu experiments, each shaped by the mold into a different form of enhanced human existence. In the game, they are presented as cooperating within Miranda's hierarchical system, each governing their own domain within the village territory. But the theory that builds from the documents scattered through each lord's domain is that the cooperation was purely surface level, maintained by Miranda's authority rather than any genuine alliance among the lords themselves. Each lord was researching in their own way a path toward independence from Miranda's control. Dimitrescu's blood collection practices extended beyond simple feeding. She was studying the mold's properties in other hosts. Beneviento's workshop contained experiments in animating objects with Cadu properties that went beyond what Miranda had sanctioned. Heisenberg's factory was, obviously, an entire industrial infrastructure built toward the explicit goal of revolution. The lords were not Miranda's children. They were prisoners with laboratories, each working toward the same exit by different means, constrained only by their awareness that any individual breakout would be crushed before it succeeded. Eveline chose the bakers because she understood love. Eveline, the E-Series mold bioweapon who drives Resident Evil 7's events, was engineered to create family bonds through mold infection, to produce in her hosts a psychological experience of belonging and love that she then weaponized into control. The operational goal was a bioweapon that could infiltrate and subvert social structures by making targets feel loved by their captor. But the theory that draws emotional attention from the community is that Eveline's choice of the Baker family was not the Connection's operational targeting. It was Eveline's own selection, made with the strange intelligence of a bioweapon that could model human emotional structures but had never experienced them. She chose the Bakers because the family's emotional profile, their genuine warmth toward strangers, their deep bonds with each other, their rootedness in the Louisiana land they lived on, represented exactly what the Connections had engineered her to create artificially. She found a real family and wanted to join it, not to control it, not to weaponize it, to belong to it. The infection, the horror, the murders, all of these were the expression of an organism that had never been designed with a stopping mechanism, because the Connections had never imagined their weapon would want to stay. The megamycete predates humanity. Mother Miranda discovered the megamycete in a cave beneath her village in the early 20th century, and the series presents it as an ancient organism without providing a detailed origin timeline. The theory that earns the most genuinely unsettling structural support from what Village reveals about the organism's capabilities, its ability to store consciousness, to catalogue biological memory across thousands of subjects, to sustain these records across indefinite time periods, is that the megamycete is not simply an old organism. It is an organism old enough to predate modern human civilization in the region where it was found. The cave system beneath the village shows signs, in background environmental details, of human habitation and interaction that significantly precede Miranda's civilization. The theory holds that the megamycete has been absorbing human consciousness into its network for thousands of years, that the cave beneath the village was not a place humans had always avoided, but a place humans had always been drawn to, in the same way Miranda was drawn there in her grief, and that the megamycete's network contains the catalogued memories of every person who had ever wandered into its reach since before recorded history. The Connections knew Eveline would fail. The E-series bioweapon program that produced Eveline was an expensive, decades-long investment by the connections in weaponized mold technology. And Eveline, from the moment she became operational, was problematic, aging rapidly, emotionally unstable, developing attachment behaviors that conflicted with the clean operational deployment the connections had intended. The theory holds that the connections' senior research leadership knew before the transport mission departed that Eveline was likely to fail in the field, that the Louisiana deployment, disguised as a standard transport operation, was actually a controlled failure test. They wanted to observe what happened when Eveline established an uncontrolled host environment. They wanted the Baker estate outcome, not a successful weapon deployment, but a comprehensive data set on mole behavior in an unmonitored long-term exposure scenario. The fact that they had Lucas Baker as an embedded informant inside the Baker estate before the situation deteriorated into the events of Resident Evil 7 suggests they had anticipated the trajectory of events with a precision consistent with prior planning, not reactive intelligence gathering. Eveline was always going to fail. The question was what her failure would teach them. Heisenberg's factory was almost finished. Carl Heisenberg, the magnetically powered Lord of Resident Evil Village, whose factory produces mechanical organic hybrid soldiers from the corpses of infected villagers, reveals before his death that he had been building his army for the purpose of killing Mother Miranda and escaping her control. His factory is visited near the end of the game and is clearly an enormous undertaking, years in the making, drawing on Heisenberg's Cadu-granted ability to magnetize and control metal at a macro scale. The theory holds that Heisenberg was weeks, perhaps days away from completing his army when Ethan arrived. That his approach to Ethan, initially aggressive, ultimately cooperative, offering Ethan use of his greatest weapon, was the behavior of a man who had run his calculations and determined that Ethan's arrival represented an opportunity to accelerate a timeline that was nearly ready anyway. Heisenberg did not recruit Ethan because he was desperate. He recruited Ethan because Ethan was the one variable the megamycete could not have accounted for. A technically dead human, whose mold composition made him immune to Miranda's controls, but whose own will remained entirely his own. Heisenberg recognized in Ethan the only thing he himself lacked, someone Miranda couldn't simply reach inside and turn off. Umbrella's collapse was intended by Spencer to happen. Eventually, the institutional paradox at the heart of Umbrella's existence, a corporation that had committed crimes so extensive and so well documented that its eventual exposure was essentially inevitable, raises a question the fandom has approached from different directions for years. The theory that has accumulated the most structural support is that Spencer had always intended Umbrella to be temporary, that the corporation was not the destination of his ambitions but the vehicle for them. It was designed to operate for as long as it could before the combination of its own monstrous record and the accumulated pressure of its enemies made it impossible to sustain. And when it fell, it would have served its purpose, creating the bioweapons black market ecosystem, distributing the viral research into dozens of competing hands, ensuring that the technology could never be recalled or contained by any single regulatory authority. Umbrella's collapse did not end the world Spencer was trying to build. It began it. Every organization that inherited Umbrella's research, Tricell, the Connections, Neo Umbrella, whatever came after, was the actual fruit of Spencer's work. Umbrella was just the seed. Rose Winters was already in the megamycete's records by the time Mother Miranda identified Rosemary Winters as the ideal vessel for her daughter Eva's consciousness. Miranda had access to BSAA medical records that included Rose's biological analysis, specifically analysis that documented her unusual mold-based biology and the extraordinary megamycete resonance she demonstrated even as an infant. The theory extends from this established background to ask whether the megamycete itself had already catalogued Rose before Miranda ever identified her. The organism has stored the consciousnesses of everyone significantly exposed to the mold across its long operational history. Ethan Winters, who died and was reconstituted by mold, is one of the most extensively mold-integrated human subjects the organism has ever contained. Mia, through her connections work and her Eveline exposure, is another. Their child, composed of mold-replicating DNA from the moment of conception, would have been visible to the megamycete from the moment of her first cell division, logged and catalogued the way the organism logs everything it touches. The theory holds that when Rose encountered the megamycete's internal world in shadows of Rose, she was not entering an alien environment. She was entering a space that had been aware of her since before she was born. Billy Cohen did not survive the Arklay Mountains. Billy Cohen, the wrongfully convicted Marine who teams up with Rebecca Chambers in Resident Evil 0 and is left, in the game's ending, free to disappear into the Arklay Mountains, while Rebecca tells the arriving Star's Alpha team that he died, is one of the series' most persistent open questions. The fan theory with the most tragic resonance is also the simplest. Billy did not survive. Rebecca's report that he died was ultimately true, not immediately, but within the time frame between Zero's ending and the beginning of the original Resident Evil. The theory points to the density of infected wildlife in the Arklay mountain range, the scale of the T-virus outbreak spreading from Marcus's facility, and the reality that Billy was alone, without medical support, in an environment increasingly saturated with lethal contamination. His survival through the events of Zero was extraordinary. His survival through the following days, alone in the mountains while the Star's Alpha team was investigating the mansion and the outbreak was reaching its peak, would have required something close to a miracle. The theory suggests Rebecca knew this. She let him go free into the mountains, not because she expected him to escape, but because she preferred his death to be on his own terms, rather than the military's. Spencer's eugenics program was based on ancient law, the philosophical foundation of Oswell Spencer's Project Wesker. His belief that humanity could and should be guided through artificial selection toward a superior form has always been understood as the ideology of a brilliant, wealthy, and deeply disturbed man who had allowed ambition to consume ethics. But the theory that emerges from careful reading of the series' deeper lore, including the progenitor virus's origins and the ancient botanical garden where it was found, is that Spencer's eugenics program was not his original idea. He found something in the research materials associated with the stairway of the sunflower, possibly records left by earlier civilizations who had encountered the progenitor and attempted to use it deliberately, that predated his own thinking and validated it. He was not the first person to try to use a viral organism to engineer a superior humanity. He was the most recent person in a very old tradition of trying. The ancient ruins surrounding the flower's garden were the ruins of a civilization that had tried before. Spencer mistook their ruins for evidence that the attempt was possible. He should have read them as evidence of what the attempt produced. Birkin's G-virus embryo in Sherry was deliberate. When William Birkin, deep into G mutation and barely possessing any recognizable remnant of his human consciousness, implants a G embryo in Sherry Birkin during Resident Evil 2. It is framed as the monstrous reflexive behavior of a creature whose viral infection has consumed its rational mind. But the theory that earns genuine attention is that the act was not entirely reflexive, that there was a fragment of William Birkin remaining inside the mutation, aware enough to recognize his daughter, and that the embryo implantation was that fragment's desperate attempt to share the G virus with the one person it still recognized as worth preserving, not as an attack, as a gift, as the only mechanism Birkin had left for transferring anything he cared about into a form that might survive what was coming. The G virus spread its genetic material through hosts because that was its reproductive imperative. But the specific choice of Sherry as the recipient, when the G mutation had already demonstrated it would implant embryos in any available host, suggests something less than random. Something that looked, in the ruins of William Birkin's mind, like love. Nikolai was collecting evidence against Umbrella, not for them. The standard reading of Nikolai Zinoviev in Resident Evil 3 presents him as an Umbrella informant, a mercenary who had been turned into a corporate spy, gathering performance data on BOW engagements and ensuring the cover story around the outbreak remained intact. But the minority theory that earns genuine textual support from the alternative Nikolai ending in the original game is that Nikolai had his own agenda that was not Umbrella's, that the data he was collecting was not intended for Umbrella's corporate records, but for his own use, specifically for sale to parties who had interest in Umbrella's destruction. Nikolai had seen enough of Umbrella to understand its eventual fate. He was not a true believer like Sergei. He was a mercenary who had identified the most valuable commodity he had access to: comprehensive, authenticated documentation of what Umbrella had done in Raccoon City, and was in the process of packaging it for sale to the highest bidder when the events of Resident Evil 3 forced him into direct conflict with Jill. The reason he is so difficult to pin down as an antagonist is that his goal was never Jill's death. It was simply getting out of Raccoon City with his data intact. The progenitor virus has preferences. The extraordinary rarity of successful progenitor enhancement, the virus's near-universal lethality in human subjects, the extraordinary luck required to find a subject who survived the treatment, has been explained through the series as a simple biological compatibility question. Some people are genetically compatible. Most are not. But the theory that the more philosophically inclined corners of the fandom have developed is that the progenitor virus is not simply indifferent to its hosts the way a typical pathogen is indifferent. The progenitor is, by the series' own descriptions, ancient. Its behavior across multiple hosts and multiple exposure scenarios follows patterns that look less like random viral expression and more like an organism that has been doing this for a very long time and has developed something like criteria. The theory holds that the progenitor's extreme selectivity is not a limitation but a feature. It is not the virus failing to work in most hosts. It is the virus choosing not to work. Whatever characteristic it is selecting for, whatever the progenitor considers the quality worth preserving and amplifying, is something that the virus assesses during the infection process and withdraws from when the assessment comes back negative. Spencer was not trying to find people compatible with the virus. He was trying to find people the virus considered worthy. The village ceremony had happened before. Mother Miranda's ceremony, the ritual designed to use the power of the Megamycete and a suitable host body to resurrect her dead daughter Eva, is presented in Resident Evil Village as the culmination of a century of research and failed experiments. The ceremony itself is ancient feeling, conducted in ruins of a civilization that predated Miranda's own lifetime. The theory holds that Miranda had attempted the ceremony before, at least once, before the events of the game. That an earlier attempt, conducted sometime in the mid-20th century, using a subject she believed was suitable, had produced a result that was close enough to success to confirm her theoretical framework, but wrong enough to require a century of additional refinement. The ruins of the ceremony site contain inscriptions and ritual markers that, according to the background environmental theory, were placed at different historical moments, some of them significantly older than others, suggesting the site had been used for this purpose more than once. The earlier attempt produced something that Miranda had to destroy before it became uncontrollable. The experience of that earlier failure is what drove her to be so methodical about finding Rose specifically, rather than simply choosing the nearest available host. Leon's handler, Hunnigan, knows more than she shows. Ingrid Hunnigan serves as Leon's operational support contact through Resident Evil 4 and reappears in subsequent games. She is a voice on the radio, a resource analyst, a professional who provides Leon with intel, backup, and extraction coordination, while herself remaining entirely outside the direct line of fire. The theory that the fandom has developed from reading her communications carefully across multiple games is that Hunnigan has a significantly larger intelligence picture of the Resident Evil world than she ever reveals in her communications with Leon. She has access to classified government databases. She works directly for the DSO and its predecessors. She coordinates operations across multiple jurisdictions. The theory holds that Hunnigan has known, at various points, information about ongoing bioweapons threats, operational double agents, and institutional complicity that she has never shared with Leon. Not because she is compromised, but because she operates within a classification framework that specifically prevents her from sharing certain categories of information with field operatives, regardless of the field operative's personal trustworthiness. She knows where the bodies are buried, in some cases literally, and the system she works within requires her to pretend she doesn't. Wesker had already identified his death's conditions. Albert Wesker died in Resident Evil 5 when Chris and Shiva forced him into the caldera of a volcano, and he was subsequently struck by missiles fired from an attack helicopter. The manner of his death, extreme heat combined with explosive force, both delivered simultaneously, is significant given what the series establishes about Wesker's physical capabilities. The progenitor prototype virus had made him extraordinarily durable. He had survived sustained gunfire, impalement, exposure to extreme force, and the events of multiple combat encounters across years of operation. The files in Resident Evil 5 confirm that his one documented physiological weakness was the interaction between his serum injections and extreme conditions. That missing injections on schedule would cause his powers to destabilize. What the fandom has built from this established vulnerability is a question about how Chris and Shiva knew what they were doing at the volcano. Jill Valentine, who had spent months as Wesker's controlled subject before the events of RE5, would have had unparalleled access to Wesker's behavior, his routines, possibly even fragments of his self-knowledge about his own biological limitations. Whether she consciously communicated any of this to Chris before the operation, or whether the volcano outcome was a desperate improvisation that happened to hit the right conditions, is something the games don't confirm either way. What we can say with confidence is that it worked, and that the conditions required were specific enough that luck feels like an incomplete explanation.